From making charcoal in the Peace Corps to farming and forestry, Peter Spiro's early journey to find his career field is perhaps the most circuitous we've explored thus far on Leading Smart. But in forestry he found a need for data, and through it, a passion for databases that store and manipulate it. A job in one of the creative centers for the nascent world of databases spawned a career at the forefront of technology we all rely on every day, whether we realize it or not. Peter's career in the tech world is highlighted by his role in completely reinventing Microsoft's flagship database product, SQL Server. That product went from distant also-ran to one of the stars in the field in a period of just a few years, largely on the skills of Peter and his peers. Today, the product leads the market once dominated by Oracle, and annual sales are measured in billions of dollars. But Peter's career is more nuanced than simple astounding success. He took on an incredibly difficult and complex project the entire company was betting on. The Lofty project collapsed, and that process taught Peter a great deal about management and building teams, especially in extremely complex and politically charged environments. Throughout it all, Peter built not only a career but a fascination with leadership. He created a management training course that led cohorts of his managers and peers in bi-weekly leadership training sessions. He worked to mentor and develop teams as the recognized village elder. And now he's using his skills to help a variety of worthy causes in his post-tech life. Peter shared his passion for leadership in a fascinating conversation about his experience in periods of rapid change. And that's what this is all about. This is Leading Smart, the show about managing in the brainpower age. It's a field guide to the joys and challenges of leading and working in the modern workplace. I'm Chris Williams, your guide to the stories and ideas that I hope will inspire you to be a better leader in the world of knowledge work. This episode is another of my conversations with leaders. This time it's with a one-time charcoal maker and database expert, now a leadership maven. This is episode 221, my conversation with Peter Spiro. I interviewed Peter Spiro on the patio of his beautiful home on an island on the shores of Puget Sound. I took a ferry from downtown Seattle, wound across the island through a small coastal village, and ended up on the beachside lane to his house. It looked remarkably like a seaside from Peter's New England roots. When I arrived, it was hard to miss the well-traveled camper van parked aside the house. It was covered with dozens of stickers from parks and adventures far and wide. Peter credits his early life in New England with laying the foundation for his understanding of relationships and passion for adventure.
So I come from a large Greek family, Manchester, New Hampshire. My grandparents came over, turn of the century, all immigrants, didn't speak English. My mother was one of 9. My father, who was Greek-Albanian, was one of 4. They all had 4 kids. So I grew up in this town with like 50 relatives, all within a few miles of my house. You know, my grandmother lived next door in the duplex. 2 other families were within a block or 2. So this background was a lot of people around, sort of a fair bit of chaos, a lot of communication, and a lot of social relationships. And all this kind of stuff eventually led to, I think, an interesting foundation for leadership and management principles. So when it was time to go to college, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And this was in the 70s, and no one was thinking, nowadays everyone's packing their resume like in middle school. So back then, no one really cared about that. So I figured I'd go to Northeastern in Boston because I didn't know what I wanted to do. Now, I had grown up in the restaurant business. All my aunts, many of my aunts and uncles had restaurants. And that actually was another thing that was really valuable subsequently. Because in the kitchens, there's a lot of chaos, and there's a lot of yelling, and there's a lot of stress, and you get in the weeds. And that type of thing turned out to be great training for Microsoft, believe it or not, with Bill yelling at you, whatever. So I go to Northeastern, and it was a co-op school. So I figured I could do a different profession each summer. I could be a banker, I could be a baker, whatever it was. And then when I got there, I realized, oh, no, this is a school for people who know what they want to do, because they get an internship and then they get a job right after graduation. So I didn't want that. So after my freshman year, I decided to transfer. And I was doing a lot of backpacking and camping. So I said, oh, maybe I'll study forestry. And I think I'll go out west, because I had this urge to travel. So I applied to all the state schools out west, Idaho, Montana, Washington, Colorado. Ended up going to Colorado State University and studied natural resource management there. Now, I wasn't a focused student. I was mostly screwing around. And oftentimes I'd take a semester off, and then I'd bike for 2 months, and then work for 2 months. And so, the focus was on life's experiences, not on schooling. So eventually this woman, who turned out to be my wife, moved out. One time she was going to go back to school at BU and got a full ride. And so I said, oh, I'll take the semester off. And we went back there. And then I said, I'm going biking for 2 months in New England. And so she quit her program. And so we took off and went biking around New England. So, we started to develop this pattern of enjoy life's interesting experiences. Okay, so it came time to graduate, 1979. Took me 5.5 years to get through undergrad, again, because I was taking time off. And we saw a job for the Peace Corps in Fiji. And so we went and talked to the Peace Corps recruiter, and the person said, well, yeah, I was a volunteer in the South Seas, and it's awesome. You get stoned, you lay on the beach, and you go snorkeling all day. And so we said, sign us up. We're going to Fiji. And so we filled out the Peace Corps application. It says, where you want to go? We said Fiji. It said, where don't you want to go? It said Africa, because we thought it'd be too hot. No, so we wrote in Africa. We finally got accepted, and they said, yeah, you're going to Upper Volta, West Africa. And you're going to be charcoal makers. And then at the last minute, they transferred us to Mali. So in 1980, 81, we were in the Peace Corps in Mali, West Africa. And we were charcoal makers. But we got out of there, and so we loaded up our car, 64 Chevy, and we plotted out a route across I-90, and we were going to go to Ann Arbor, Madison, Minneapolis, or Seattle. And she was going to study library science. We get into Madison, we liked the town, found a place to live, great college town in the Midwest. And so she starts going to school, and I become a corn farmer. And then after about a year of corn farming, we're planting corn and spudding it in the summer and harvesting it and seeding it. I realized not a lot of future in corn farming. And so PCs were just coming out then. And I had this idea. And so I said, I think I'll think about using this PC as a tool for private forestry consulting. And I'll use it for mapping software and growth projections. If you cut down 50% of your trees, you'll have this much more wood in 20 years, 50 years, stuff like that. So I pitched this idea to the head of the forestry department and said, why don't you let me in for a master's? And then we talked about my grades, and they were really shitty because I never went to class. He said, okay, I'll let you in on probation, right? The head of the department. And he gave me all these hard classes, and he told me to take the GREs, and I did all that. And But then before we started that, we said, ooh, I'm going to get on the job track now. And so we took 6 months off and did a trip through Asia because we knew like once I finished my master's, my wife was getting a PhD in library science, like we'd have to get real jobs. And so we did 6 months traveling around Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Nepal, hiking, New Zealand. It was awesome. We took our last $10,000 and spent it on that 6-month trip. Came back, got into grad school, started taking both forestry classes and computer science classes. And then I became the lab manager for the forestry department. They had a PDP-11, about a dozen terminals. That was really interesting. And I started to realize these computer science classes are more stimulating and more interesting than this forestry work. So,
had you had a mathematical background?
So that's sort of the interesting thing, because all through, growing up, I had more ability than I applied, and I was sort of bored, and I was fooling around, and things like that. So I had this natural math, logic, interest, and skill. It wasn't a question of talent. It was a question of what was stimulating enough to me at the time to apply myself.
Yeah.
And finally, when I got into computers, there was where I saw, oh, it's really interesting, right? And so I talked to the head of the computer science department. There's sort of funny story there, because I said, look, I've taken these 6 classes. I got all A's. Why don't you let me in? And he said, okay, sure. And there's a guy named Dave DeWitt, who I subsequently hired at Microsoft. And we started a lab with. And so then 2 weeks later, DeWitt calls me into his office and says, hey, Spiro, what the hell? Because he got my transcripts. He says, these transcripts are terrible. He got all C's and D's. And, but he said he would let me in the department, so he let me in. So I stayed like an extra year, did another 10 plus classes you needed for your master's. So in 85, at the age of 29, finally said, okay, we're ready for real jobs.
At Madison, Peter almost accidentally fell into the database world. Databases are the underlying part of a computer system that store and retrieve information. You interact with database systems hundreds of times a day. In modern life, nearly every interaction involves dozens of database events, looking up information, logging where you've been, and so on. Every purchase you make, online or not, every phone call or text, the entire social media landscape are all deeply dependent on database systems. But when Peter was in grad school, databases were a new idea, and he just so happened to be there at the leading edge.
I was lucky, and that Wisconsin-Madison at that time was probably the best department for database systems, and I found an interest in database systems. So I took like 2 database classes, then did a couple independent studies on databases. So when I was graduating, we had a first child by then, and we wanted to live back east because that's where all my family and my wife's family lived.
Peter and his wife moved back home, where he got a job at Digital Equipment Corporation, or DEC, a New England company that was the giant in the exploding mini-computer industry.
This is 84, 85. The mini computers were sort of the top of the line computers. That's where you wanted to work. IBM was a little bit they were just starting to become dinosaurs. They weren't dinosaurs yet, but you knew that company was going to become dinosaurs. And DEC, Wang, Prime, Data General, those were, king of the hill. So applied to all those firms, did interviews, got accepted, ended up working at DEC, mostly because their job offer was a little more, and it looked like a great engineering organization. And they had this wonderful facility in the woods in southern New Hampshire, and it's like, man, I got it made. So I ended up there, and I was lucky because I got placed sort of right in the database group. And furthermore, right in the portion of the database, the kernel, the subsystem, the lower part that I was most interested in. So DEC was a great engineering company. The stuff I learned there was more about engineering and teams rather than leadership. So right when I got there, I got a great mentor, a guy named Steve Klein. He was still the best engineer. He's the best engineer I've ever met. His code was like poetry, beautiful. And so he was my mentor. And so like the first couple of big projects I did, I was working sort of under Steve's wing. I'd go write code for a month or something, and then we'd look at it. It was wonderful to have that type of mentorship. Now, one of the things I subsequently learned at DEC had a category of people called consulting engineers. And your manager couldn't promote you to consulting engineer. You had to have a package that you got references from other groups. And so DEC did a study once and said, where did our consulting engineers come from? Are they Ivy League schools? Are they just smarter? Are they Indians from IIT? You know, what's the common thread among the consulting engineers? And it turned out they couldn't find hardly any common thread, except for the fact most of them had a really good mentor early in their career. Because, you know, software engineering is a craft. It's like more of an art than a science. And so having someone teach you that at the beginning is incredibly valuable, and it sort of boosts your career for the rest of your career. And so I was lucky. I had that with Steve. Then, and a couple other lucky things happened. Steve ended up quitting after about 3 years, 2 to 3 years, because another competing group was getting funded by the database group. So he's like, I don't want any of this. So he quit. So I kind of got put into a position of informal leadership or seniority, so to say, early on in my career. So that was really valuable. Then I started hiring some great people. I realized, ooh, the teaching I got at Wisconsin-Madison, that's better than most of the people I see around here. It's very applicable, the database stuff we learned. So I went to Wisconsin, started recruiting, hired like 2 people. Next year, hired 4 people. Next year, hired 10 people. And then we had this big influx of Wisconsin-Madison grads. And in our team, at one point, we had like 8 people in the team. And there must have been 5 Wisconsin-Madison people. And so I started to see at that point what makes a great team or what makes a stall team. And I sort of started to think about the relationships amongst the teams and flow, right? Hitting the right flow amongst a team. And, you know, we had one guy was a tools guy and one guy was the cleanup guy and 2 other people would be responsible for more the bulk of the code. It's interesting to see the people in their roles and how they contributed to a sort of well-oiled machine. And then, you know, towards the end of that portion, I sort of became what was known as a technical director of the group. And so I started working more officially in a cross-group fashion with the operating systems. They were coming out with a new chip, new machines called Alpha. And the whole company had to get converted to that. So they took a database guy, an operating systems guy, a languages guy, some chips guys, the hardware guys, and they had a little task force. And so I kind of learned, I was sort of by far the most junior guy in that group. I was like a 6, 7-year guy. Everyone else was like 15, 20-year person. I started to see sort of how different groups can work together and who had insight into how to make these cross-group things work. So for me, DEC was this great learning experience as to how to be an engineer.
At DEC, Peter worked on a database called RDB, which became the world's fastest database system. This got him and the whole team noticed in the tech world, and specifically by a young software company from Seattle called Microsoft. The person who noticed was David Vaskovich, a brilliant technical mind with a way with words and a knack for recruiting the best talent.
So we became very successful with our product. It's called RDB. And we also had another product called DBMS, both built on the same core. When I got there, we were doing 3 transactions a second. And by the time I left, we were doing 3,600 transactions a second. So you don't get 3 orders of magnitude improvement very often. That's like really rare. And so we had become sort of some known people in the industry. When we hit 3,600 transactions a second, it was world record. And there's another person I should mention, Jim Gray got hired by Microsoft, and he sort of served as a mentor. I remember when I started, Gray and Tandem were doing 200 transactions a second. And we were like, oh my God, how do they even do that? It was amazing. And there's a conference in California called High Performance Transaction Systems. And this was sort of Jim Gray's conference. And it was like 60 people, invite only, had to write a paper. There was some little committee and you got invited. And these were the senior enterprise guys from Tandem, IBM, stuff like that. I'd given some talks previously, but Vaskovich showed up. Okay. Well, and we're all like, who the hell is this guy Vaskovich from Microsoft? That's this little PC company. What's he doing here? So it turns out he had been talking to Gray, got himself invited. So he's up there, giving this talk. And it was a weird talk because we were all about transaction commit times and, logging and recovery and replication. And he's talking about this object-oriented languages stuff. And we're all like, what the hell is he talking about? But it turns out he was mostly there to poach a bunch of people. And from that conference, he ended up hiring at least 10. There's only 60 people there. He must have hired at least a dozen of them over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's how I sort of got pulled over to Microsoft. But that gets coupled with, at DEC, right after we set that world record, DEC was a hardware and a software company. And they were running into financial trouble, 93, 92, 93, 94. And the CEO, we had never met him before, Bob Palmer, comes in and says, great job, congratulations. We're all standing there so excited because we just set this world record. And he says, yeah, but we might end up selling you guys. We're like, what the hell? Because we thought it was our day of glory. Instead, he tells us he's going to sell us. And so right at around this time, Jim Gray says to me, Peter, you should go out and kick the tires. I'm like, what are you talking about? I figure I'm going to work at DEC for life, right? I'm set. And he says, no, you should get out and kick the tires. And so I interviewed for a couple of places in the Boston area. But, Vaskovich then met me and started recruiting me. And Microsoft was recruiting me sort of late 93, early 94, I guess what it was. And, ended up with really such a good opportunity. It was sort of to get hired as a change agent. They had a little database team. But I figured the professional opportunity, the interesting place to be, Seattle, and as well as the financial opportunity was too good to pass up. So we had 3 kids by then. We were settled. We thought we were lifers in New England. But it was just too good an opportunity to pass up. So in 94, joined Microsoft.
When Peter started at Microsoft, he joined the team working on the company's flagship database product, SQL Server. The product had struggled to make ground against the big companies like IBM, Tandem, DEC, and most importantly, Oracle, which was taking the database world by storm.
I remember coming out and interviewed. I interviewed 8 in the morning to 11 at night. And finally got back to Vaskovich's office at 11 at night. And he made me this offer. Okay, went out with dinner and all this kind of stuff. And it was a long, hard interview, like 2 people at a time, 2 or 3 of the interviews in there. So, but Vaskovich was pitching, look, we need you, we're hiring you as a change agent, okay? Because we have to grow the team and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, how hard can it be, change agent? I've just been fighting database wars at DEC for almost 10 years. But it turns out the team itself needed a lot of change. Because it needed to change. The code base wasn't good. The processes weren't going to scale to build a world-class product. The people themselves were more like generalists. They were very good. They were doing sort of miraculous work, given there were about 6 of them, competing with hundreds from Oracle, right? Or the other companies. But we needed specialists. You needed query processing guys, you need storage engine guys, you need language guys. So we needed to change everything about the org. But the team was like, who's this fucking smart guy on the side that's supposed to come in and tell us what to do? Because I looked at the code was crappy. See, the code base was inherited from Sybase and it was built in the early 80s to mid 80s. And it was buggy. It was buggy as hell. So, I looked at all this stuff and realized we had to make significant changes in all dimensions. And no one likes to hear that. Like no one, you're the smart guy from the outside who's telling us everything we're doing is shit, even though they were doing great work, but it wasn't the work that was going to get us to a super successful product. So, the first couple of years were really hard. It was just hard. But then as we grew, I they said, okay, now we're up to like 12, 13 people. Ron Sukup was the manager. He's a very good manager, but said, look, we got to break this up into two groups. So why don't you become the formal lead for the bottom portion? And I said, I've never been a manager in my life. I don't want to be a lead like that. But he sort of talked me into it. And once I became that lead, then I realized, I can have a little more impact, a little bit more power. I can grow my team and it's easier to change the culture to how I want it as compared to being an outsider. So, that's sort of what happened. Eventually grew that team.
Peter and the rest of the SQL Server team completely rebuilt the product and released version 7.0, which was an enormous success. 7.0 was a huge hit. The fortunes of that team went from sort of meh to it was...
Yeah, we were superstars.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so 7.0 looked at from the outside, and even by outside I mean non-SQL Server team within Microsoft, was sort of a miracle. This was mid-90s, right? Databases had sort of become figured out by then. So in the late 70s, 80s, there was a lot of experimentation. Like, what's the right way to do logging? All these locking protocols, they all got normalized. But some of the companies like Oracle or whatever, they had built into their architecture, solutions that didn't scale as well, as going to be problematic in the future. We were lucky. We were able to throw away the code base, and we knew how to build the best system going because all the different pieces we had figured out. At one point I counted, and we had in our team, there was maybe a dozen people, 10 people. That's the bottom portion. We had worked on over 20 different systems in our careers. So, I started hiring more senior people with experience, more talent out of school, went back to Wisconsin, tapped that pipeline again, and just started growing the team. And when we did 7.0, we did the whole thing in 2.5 years, which sounds long, but to build a whole database system, it's really fast. So it was kind of risky, but we knew what we were doing. We had the playbook in our pocket, so to say. Microsoft didn't know how to build databases, but we knew how to build it, and we were kind of on the side. No one really cared about us. And so it was like this miracle thing, right? That I remember we're presenting to Gates and telling them what we'd do, and they were like pretty surprised, like, oh, these guys know what the hell they're doing. And we were, Microsoft was there were parts of the company where people still running around with Nerf guns and shooting each other and jumping in hot tubs for parties.
SQL Server 7.0 was a huge turning point, not just in the database world. It supercharged the entire company's fortunes. Up to this point, Microsoft had been seen mostly as a personal computer company. Their products weren't adopted by big business. They weren't really a part of the enterprise market as it's known in the computer world. This new database system gave Microsoft the ability to sell into the massive corporate market, and that launched a sales juggernaut. Today, the company gets by far the largest share of its revenue from the very large corporations that once dismissed the company. And it was SQL Server 7.0 that led the way there. SQL 7.0 gave Microsoft sort of permission to be an enterprise company.
Yeah. They had hired Cutler and all those other ex-DEC guys to build the operating system. And they said, oh, we're an enterprise company. But like Vasquez knew, no, you're not really an enterprise company yet. So SQL Server sort of got our foot in the door. And, when I started, there were half a dozen engineers. We made 10 to 15 million. At one point we grew to 2,000 engineers making billions. That thing makes almost 10 billion now. So again, it was this sort of amazing growth. And we grew a company, I would say, so looking back, we grew a company with our own culture and technology within the whole Microsoft sphere. You know what I'm saying? But it was a different culture than the rest of the company.
With the success of the SQL Server product, Peter was asked to lead one of the most ambitious projects in Microsoft's history. It was WinFS, which stood for the Windows File System. It was to be an entirely new creation, and it would form the foundation for literally every product in the company. The scope and impact of the project was breathtaking. But WinFS began with a tiny little project called Hailstorm that had no real direction and had been adrift for quite a while. And as so often happens when Peter made the mistake of pointing that out, they put him in charge of it.
And so at one point there was a meeting, and Alchin was like, who was running the Windows team, it's like, okay, this looks fine. Any objections? And so I said, well, yeah, I mean, it's not clear what it means anymore. And so they sort of said, okay, you're the smart ass, so we're going to end up giving it to you. And so they ended up pushing it to us. And to make matters worse, I didn't realize this, they really wanted to cancel it. So we had it for like 3 to 6 months. They're like, okay, we're going to cancel this. I'm like, what? You just gave this to us. Why are you going to cancel Hailstorm? So they decided to cancel it. So we had to tell the team, okay, we're canceling this. But they still wanted sort of the mission to go on. So we canceled the Hailstorm project, but that sort of morphed into like, okay, now we have to build WinFS. And so we had just come off, it's kind of, there's some hubris here, because I was like, okay, yeah, I did, worked successfully at DEC. Then we did SQL Server. How hard can this be, right? And so we said, yeah, fine, we'll do this WinFS thing. Why not? And we didn't realize at that time what a pain in the ass, although what a wonderful learning experience it was going to be also. So away we go, sort of a core database system team got then tasked with build this new platform that the whole company was going to be bet on.
Was that team constructed out of people you knew? Were you handed that team? Did you recruit into that team?
So we, all of the above. So we got handed a couple teams, which was really problematic because they had different cultures. And they didn't really want to be joining this SQL team. So we sort of had instant team. That was a pain in the ass. The SQL Server team wasn't that interested in it. Like, why are we doing WinFS? We're making a ton of money over here with SQL Server. We know we have 10 years of innovation in front of us. Why get us confused there? Then the company was pretty much bet on it. Bill was then pushing everyone. Outlook, Office, Exchange. The Windows shell was going to be layered on it. So Access. So we sort of said, look, give us one customer to start. And they said, no, you need 2, you need 3. Then they kept pushing us. So pretty soon the whole company was layered on us. We were incubating this technology while the company was bet on it. I remember the first year we were just experimenting because we were incubating, right? And, people were looking for schedules, like long-term, 2-year schedule out from that. And I said, we don't know the schedule, we're incubating. So, but, they wanted a really clear schedule. And so there are a lot of issues with WinFS around the technology, what it was supposed to be, the people, the dates, in all dimensions.
At this point, Peter and the WinFS team were chartered with building a core technology from scratch that the entire company would be dependent on. They managed to build it and were ready to start testing it, but they were pushed to be released as part of a project codenamed Longhorn, which would eventually become the ill-fated Windows Vista.
The way this played out, so it has an interesting play out. So we build this thing, and then it was all going to be in Longhorn, all right? So then Longhorn was becoming late because everything was wrapped together in Longhorn. There was Windows and SQL Server and the languages guys, dev. And at one point I remember we had to make a change. In order for us to make a change, then it had to get sort of shipped to Windows. Then it had to get shipped to dev before they could test this. And this took months. Okay, so, a change where you have to integrate multi-components like that, instead of days, took months. It was insane. And in general, no one had a good handle on Longhorn, right? I remember at one point, Longhorn had 50,000 bugs in their database. And you don't know what the hell's going on when you got 50,000 bugs, right? Backlog. So Alchin was sort of asking about schedule. No one had a good answer on schedule. So we had this meeting and said, what are we going to do here? They said, we need to pull this in. We're only going to have one beta, and it's got to ship by the end of this year, the subsequent year. And I said, look, we're an enterprise platform. I can't go out with one beta. That's not I think I can make that date, but I cannot go with one beta. And no one's going to make that date because there's too many interactions. And others said, no, we can make the date. We can make that date. And so I said, I can't make the date. So we pulled ourselves out of Longhorn. Now, it's sort of a funny story, and I don't want this to sound bad, but so then Steve calls me in his office and says, okay, we got to write the marketing thing as to why Longhorn slipped. And so WinFS is the problem. I'm like, we're not the problem, right? And so I was up there and having to write that. And, that was super painful. But at the same time, one of the things I was most proud about is the team. We told the team and we said, okay, we pulled ourselves out of Longhorn and we're going to keep building the thing. We'll ship it in the subsequent release. And most teams at that point would implode, right? We had 150 people working on this for 2 years. And all of a sudden you're kicked out of a release, so to say. But we only lost like 2 to 3 people, in part because we had hired people who were comfortable with the risk, who liked risk, who weren't afraid of it. We had kept them informed the entire time. They were mature about it. And we just said, okay, we have another milestone. This was about in August. We said, okay, we got a new milestone. It's the end of December. We got to do this because in order to hit our beta for March, we got to do this. So we just, managed to flip the team, create a new plan, and away we go.
But alas, though they kept building the project, WinFS couldn't find a home and was never going to be released. That's when Peter faced a crucial decision.
We can either keep going with this and implode, or we can cancel it ourselves, cancel the WinFS project, but let's take the technologies and roll them into SQL Server. So a good portion of the stuff we had built then got rolled into SQL Server. And then we rolled the team back into SQL Server also. So there was a real interesting piece about this, which was we had hired lots of great talent. In some senses, it was an overqualified team. At one point, I remember most of Microsoft had like 2% partners. We had like 10% partners. So, and we had hired people who weren't database people, right? They were design people or user experience people or network people or stuff like this. So it was interesting. We brought more interesting talent into the team. So when we decided to stop working on the thing called WinFS, as we moved the technology back, we moved the people back also. And a lot of people were pissed about that. A lot of the original SQL guys, because they're like, wait, you guys just failed, right? Why are you taking Samit, who's obviously a brilliant guy, but putting him in charge of the engine? And so we had a real tough cultural moment around, should we penalize these guys for not shipping? Even though if you consider all the factors around what they did great work. Or should we utilize their talents at the expense of other people feeling pissed? And some of the real talent, as they came back, took over jobs that other people had been in. But these guys were better people. And so that was a real tough period there.
When I first talked to Peter, I said that, at least externally, WinFS was widely viewed as a failure, but he recoiled at that description. He felt he learned a great deal about managing teams through that experience. One of the crucial things was communication. He had been quite diligent about keeping the team up to speed throughout the many twists and turns of the project.
So I learned more on that WinFS journey of 3 to 4 years than I would say I learned in the previous 10 about leadership, okay? And one of the things we did was every Friday, we got the whole team in a room, had pizza and beer, and for an hour meeting, and we didn't have slides, and I would be up front drinking a beer.
How big is the team at this point?
100, 120.
Okay, something like that. Okay.
Yeah, and fit in one of those bigger conference rooms, not the monster ones, because those are too big, but whatever. And my leadership team would be in there, and we'd talk. Well, we talk about how we're progressing, stuff like that, but we'd also talk about the sort of our status in the company. Hey, we talked to Bill this week and blah, blah, blah. And we were talking to Bill like every other week. It was a big pain in the ass. Like everyone's dying to get time with Bill, right? We were like, oh, damn, we got to go talk to Bill again because it was, just painful.
And you were right at the center of a whole lot of pieces.
Yeah, right. But we would tell them, sort of the political winds of what's happening. Like I remember telling them, okay, it was December. Alston's going to cancel us unless we get to this performance goal by March, right? And so we were very transparent. And it wasn't like a prepared slide deck. I was up there drinking a beer, shooting the shit. And people would ask questions, and sometimes I'd push it off to my leaders, my management team, because I wanted them to see this is the team that's running WinFS. This is not me as the sole leader. This is a team running WinFS. And yeah, Drucker's got to answer that. Quentin's got to answer that. Whatever. Pedro's got to answer that. And Neil's got to answer that. So I wanted them to have faith in the leadership team. And I wanted them to see the frank truth. And it was during this period that I realized this whole difference between dissonant and resonant leadership. The team knew that I and my leadership team understood how they were thinking. And you know what? And so they could look at us and they say, oh, Spiro understands our fears, what we're thinking about, things like that. So we knew what they were thinking about, and they knew that we knew it. So, and that was really important. And so when, for example, I had to tell them it was canceled, and we stepped out of Longhorn, we didn't lose many people. Even when we canceled it and rolled it into SQL, we didn't lose many people because they had been kept in the loop all along the way. And when I told them, look, there's no chance we're getting into Windows, they understood it, right? I didn't have to sell them on anything. It was sort of this transparency and frankness all along the way.
One of the ways that you can insulate your team from that is actually to expose them to it, right? So that they are at least aware of what is going on to a level that they instead of hearing rumors coming back around through they're hearing it,
Oh, that's a good point. And not only that, like I said, we had hired for it. At one point, I was going around the company giving a recruiting talk. And I said, here's the 10 reasons WinFS is the hardest thing you'll ever see. And I sort of talked about this instant team. I talked about no one's built it before. I talked about the schedule. I talked about how many groups have bitten on us. I talked about how Bill's the freaking PM. Okay. And all my leads are like, Peter, what the hell are you doing? Why? This is a recruiting pitch. You're not supposed to sit here and tell them all the hard, bad things. But, I had figured if someone looks at that list and wants to join, they're keepers, right? They're not going to freak out when Alton says, hey, we're going to cancel you if you don't get this. Or, Bill throws another thing at us, or some other group tries to subvert us. So we hired, it was really interesting. The people hired were very comfortable with risk. And they were just excited about being on the team. They excited about the technology journey. And they were just excited. And
they're also more likely to have some grit, more likely to not be shocked when the earth moves out from underneath them.
Absolutely. And that's how it played out. And so think at the end of that whole WinFS thing, I went around the company and gave some talks about here's the WinFS, good, bad, and the ugly. And at the end of that slide deck, I said, even if I knew how this whole journey was going to play out, I'd do it again. Because in fact, we took those 150 super talented people with all these great characteristics, rolled them into the SQL org with technology also. So how good is that, right? And not only that, there's a thing that I talk about, and I use the word crucibles. And people, this is the thing that not many people understand. You take two talented, equal talents, sort of maybe same education, same energy, same work ethic, all this kind of stuff, and put them in an org, right? And this person over here gets better opportunities, right? And it's a little bit harder work and maybe gets mentored a little better. So she starts to make more progress than this person's over here. And then people know about her. So they throw more hard work at her. So she makes more progress. So timing and opportunity and stepping into a crucible that's really difficult, that causes you to change and grow, that's how you turn, that's how you want to play your career. I've often said that my career played out every 4 to 6 years, I found myself tweaking not on purpose. Okay, this was really weird. I only realized this at 20 years in. Hey, I've had these 4 different experiences in my career, and each of them were this growth path. So if you plot someone's growth, it goes like this, right? The first 3 to 4 years, and then it levels out, 5, 6, and 7. So some people, go another 10 years, and they haven't grown. What you really want to do is grow and grow and grow and grow. So then you realize 20 years later, man, I've had these I've gone through these crucibles. They're really hard. I've got tremendous growth. And now I'm a world-class person.
During this time, Peter also decided to create his own leadership training within his organization.
At DEC, I was a hands-on engineer really for nine years, writing code all the time. But the last 2 to 3 of those, so after about 6 years, then I got hooked in with that task force and I started doing this technical director thing. And that was more interesting to me, right? I get to Microsoft, my first couple of years as an architect, then I'm sort of a leader. Then I do this WinFS. And I found, that at that point, and bored is not the right word, but the challenge of leading teams, leading people, understanding how teams succeed, turned into more stimulating challenge than the technology challenge, because I had been doing that for 10, 15 years. And so somewhere in that time frame, I don't exactly know, the SQL team was about 2,000 people. Oh no, maybe 1,500 people. We had like a couple hundred managers. And I was doing WinFS, so I started paying more attention to leadership and management. Took a few management classes, reading a lot of books, stuff like that. But then I realized, that person's a good manager, that person's not a good manager. We have no system and process in place for determining that. And we haven't shared any cultural values or practices. And so I had this idea like, hey, let's create some classes. And SQL was composed of like 8 different teams, you know what I'm saying? So in 3 main groups. So I said, let's get together a series of people, a set of people, a cohort, like 20 people. We'll meet once every 2 weeks for a year. So we'll do like 25 sessions, 25 sessions, because maybe we skipped one, whatever. And we'll pull them together for 2 hours. We'll eat lunch, because I believe breaking bread with people is something I learned from a guy named Jim Ellis. That's a whole different story, who's a famous civic hero in Seattle. I don't know if you know of him. But I was on the board for this Mountains to Sound Greenway, and we started every board meeting with a big meal between 60 people. And it just enabled stronger relationships. Whatever. Anyway, so we'd eat lunch.
There's some Greek heritage plowing its way back in there
absolutely,
too.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. And so, we'd eat lunch, then we'd have a topic, hiring, firing, how you do stack ranking, what do you think of teams, what makes a great team, what makes a great leader, stuff like that. We brought in some guest speakers, some from the leadership team, the leadership training people, the HR people at Microsoft, some just different VPs around the company. And I was sort of I wasn't there lecturing, I was an orchestrator of the room and giving opinions like everyone else. But we learned so much from each other. And so we started to then normalize our leadership and management traits. And everyone loved it, and it was super successful. So we said, next year, and that was the plan, let's scale it up. Let's do 4 of these classes. So 4 cohorts, so we could get another 80 people. And then after another year, we do another 4. And that's when I really started to dive deeper in leadership topics. And I found that was what was stimulating to me at that point. Because again, it was an opportunity to step into a new realm that was creative and challenging. I sort of find, once I learned something, I kind of look into what can I learn next? What's the next interesting challenge? And at that point, it was a people, teams kind of challenge, leadership challenge. The great thing was, you look back at that original cohort, and they've all gone on to do really wonderful things, like at different companies, they're VPs or stayed at SQL, just really talented people who all, I think, had a shared growth experience through that particular year.
Eventually, Peter moved into a role he invented, more of an emeritus role. He called it being the village elder.
I pitched this idea. I said, look, instead of letting these senior guys retire, why don't you give them an office, healthcare, and a computer, call them a Microsoft emeritus, and tell them to come in whenever they want, right? They'll still arbitrate conflicts. They can review architectures. They can go to conferences and be a Microsoft emeritus. It's like a professor emeritus, right? And so in 2008, that's what I did. It was a pretty valuable role because I was sort of like a trusted senior advisor to the VP. One time, the test lead or some test manager left, so I stepped into that role for 6 months. I was able to do sort of point problems, point projects, give advice, and tell stories. At that point, I was telling stories. I called myself the village elder. Yeah, so I did that for 4 years. I had started to hit that flattening of the curve on the learning. So even this role was becoming less challenging, less stimulating. Look, it was a sweet gig. There was no question, right? Leave, come back, still hang around with the smart people, have influence. But I started at that point want to do more outside of Microsoft. And so pulled the plug in 2012 and started doing more philanthropy type of work or social impact investing work. I've been thinking, what am I going to do after Microsoft? I said, this is what we should do. We should find, fund, and mentor early stage nonprofits. It was sort of like being the village elder, but to nonprofits. So I hooked up with, 2 other ex-Microsoft execs, Paul Flessner and Rob Short, and we pitched this idea. We had 4 criteria. So after we talked about it, came up with this idea. We wanted early stage organization, company, because we didn't want it too far along because we wanted to influence what the idea was. We wanted it to be a scalable idea. So we didn't want 4 wells in Africa. We wanted, hey, we're going to change the water system for Kenya, or have an electrical system with solar power. We wanted scalable ideas because it came from Microsoft, right? At DEC, you talked about thousands of customers. At Microsoft, you talked about millions to billions. So we were familiar with scale. Then our third criteria was we wanted a great leader because it's so hard, as you know, right? And there's going to be bumps in the road and roadblocks, and you got to bob and weave. And a lot of these guys, people who start nonprofits, they're really smart. They're 26 years old. They got a great idea. They create a nonprofit. They raise money for 2 to 3 years. It gets to 1 to 2 million type of organization, and then it flattens out because they don't have the leadership skills or the experience or the wisdom to grow that. You know what I'm saying? So we wanted a great leader who could scale and deal with the problems. And the fourth criteria is we wanted them to want to work with us.
His group funded World Reader, whose CEO, David Risher, I interviewed a few weeks ago, and Peter served as the board chair for the better part of a decade. They also funded a few other organizations, but they couldn't find the progress they were seeking in the nonprofit world.
And then we kept looking and we couldn't really find what we wanted. And so we said, why don't we start investing in social enterprises? So for-profit companies that have a social cause. And so we started doing that instead. And so we found a company that had a reading comprehension app. So again, same criteria, early stage, scalable, good leader, great leader, want to work with us. They built a really nice product. That product eventually got bought out. And look, we're not trying to make, I'm like Google, I'm going to make a ton of money. It's more like, let's work with some smart people doing interesting things that are valuable for society.
Peter Spiro has spent a career making a difference, first in the world of database systems, and now focusing on using his passion for leadership in the world of social impact investing. I want to thank him for the fun conversation and for sharing his experience with us. Leading Smart is from me, Chris Williams. You can find out more about the show and discover other resources for leaders at my website, clwill.com. If you like the show, please share it with your friends, especially on social media. Referrals are the greatest source of new listeners. I'd also love your feedback. I'm the CL Will on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Or send an email to pod@clwill.com. That's it for this episode. The next episode will continue the series on communication. It's called Echolocation. I hope you'll listen. Until then, please remember that each of the several dozen decisions you make today are part of leading smart.